has fantasy taken a turn for the worse? Is YA fantasy just a dumbed-down version of the great fantasy classics? Are the themes overplayed, the plot's generic, or does it lack depth? Don't get me started on the romance. Is the entire appeal of YA just that it's so easy to read that you can turn your brain off entirely? Is it surface level reading that might be fun but doesn't explore deep philosophical ideas and complex social problems? If you're anything like me, then you have heard it all. YA fantasy still gets a bad rap, even though it accounts for a huge boom in book sales over the past few years. But as a 30-something avid reader of both YA and adult fantasy, I have a few things to say in defense of YA fantasy in particular. So sit down and grab your cup of tea, Brenda, because this video is going to be full of tropes. Now let's start with perhaps the most obvious or the most frequently used complaint about YA fantasy, and that's that it's too simple. Now in this video we're probably going to fall into the trap of comparing all YA fantasy and all adult fantasy and saying they're this and they're that. But for the purpose of this video, I'm probably going to have to paint them all with the same brush to make my points. So please bear that in mind. In this case, I would agree that YA fantasy is simple, but it's deceptively simple. For the most part, YA fantasy is easy to read, but that doesn't mean its themes aren't complex or they're surface level. In fact, I think it can be the opposite. In fact, a lot of the YA fantasy I've had the pleasure of reading have tackled an immense number of hard-hitting themes and plot lines, all within a shorter and more accessible format than, say, adult fantasy. YA may be easily read and digested at the surface level, but these books contain meaning. YA tells emotional truths at the character level. We get to go on a journey with the character as they make mistakes, they learn from them, and they grow as a person. While adult fantasy also does this, YA strips away the heavy language and metaphors and helps us to feel something. You're going on a journey at the same time as the character. You're not just witnessing it from afar. The classic coming-of-age tales are popular for a reason, and it's because we can all relate to them. We've all been forced to make a decision at one point in our lives that has changed us forever. We lost innocence and gained experience. Whether it's finding out that we have magical powers or our parents aren't who they say they are, we've experienced loss, been thrust into unknown situations, and have felt confused as we learn more about the world. We can relate to these situations even if they're told in a fantasy setting, and while they may all be tropes, there's a reason why they work time and time again. Tropes don't mean bad writing, it just means that the author knows what the readers want, and that's to escape and be lost in these stories over and over again. YA also does something that I'm not sure I've ever experienced in an adult fantasy book. It lets the reader interpret the story's events however they see fit. It makes room for the reader to take away what they want from a story, to imagine a scene differently by interpreting it their way, to find themselves in the story because it's not packed with dense dialogue and prose. You're not just reading a character's journey in YA, you're there with them. You can get lost easily and adapt it to suit you, instead of having to read the story slowly or over and over to get its meaning. The simpler writing style of YA fantasy doesn't mean that it's not real literature, it just means that it's a different writing style. It's as simple as that. YA fantasy can have complex storylines, hard-hitting topics, and even philosophy woven into it. The difference is it's easy to consume, and I don't know about you, but I need that these days. Alright, writing style aside, let's move on to something that touches my soul, and that is that YA fantasy is for children, and if you read it, you're childish. It goes without saying that I'm not alone in this. Even actual young adults have been judged for reading YA fantasy. Today though, 30-something-year-olds like me create whole Bookstagram accounts almost 100% dedicated to YA fantasy. In fact, a 2012 survey by a market research firm found that 55% of these books are bought by people over the age of 18. The largest group of buyers, and I mean 28% of all YA sales, are between ages 30 and 44. Millennials like myself didn't have access to the sheer volume of YA titles that are around now, so we're diving right in. The current prejudice of YA isn't new though. C.S. Lewis was combating it in the first half of the 20th century, it's just that back then the debate was over fairy stories. In his essay on 3 Ways of Writing for Children, Lewis seems to think that the main question was whether it's childish to read children's stories, saying, "Now the modern critical world uses adult as a term of approval. It's hostile to what it calls nostalgia and contemptuous of what it calls Peter Pantheism. Hence a man who admits that dwarves and giants and talking beasts and witches are still dear to him in his 53rd year is now less likely to be praised for his perennial youth than scorned and pitied for arrested development." He goes on to express something really important in this essay, and that's as while he's older, he's actually appreciating these stories more than he did in his youth. Growth means being able to appreciate more in a second sense as well. I now enjoy the fairy tales better than I did in childhood. Being now able to put more in, of course, I get more out. I am almost inclined to set it up as a canon that a children's story which is enjoyed only by children is a bad children's story. The good ones last. If this reasoning is good for C.S. Lewis, it's good enough for me. Now let's talk about women, because there is no doubt about it, YA fantasy was created for us. Women, while in pop culture are not necessarily treated very well, in YA fantasy our hopes, desires, dreams, experiences are all taken seriously. I'm returning to the tropes here, Brenda, because while they may be predictable, they exist for a reason. These tropes, found family, the protagonist is an outsider, the protagonist doesn't believe in her inner power, the chosen one, and more, are all evidence of one thing. Women authors are getting to tell stories about women that we just don't see in the real world, stories that get squashed or squandered even if they actually exist, and women fantasy authors are bringing them to life. These writers were likely brought up in a world where their own hopes, dreams, fears, and desires weren't taken seriously, so here they come in the form of YA fantasy. And while these tropes can get repetitive and sometimes be done badly, their existence gives readers hope and empowerment and makes them feel seen. Plus, there are many other comparisons between YA fantasy and the only other section of the publishing world created and read by women: romance. If you read romance books, then you've probably heard many of the similar criticisms I mentioned at the start of this video. Like YA fantasy, romance books are slammed as trashy, low quality, and generally not considered real literature. They're ridiculed for their femininity and their focus on women's experiences. With this in mind, combining fantasy and the regular use of romance in YA fantasy books, and you've got the double whammy. Books like Twilight aren't taken seriously because of the love triangle focus. In fact, any YA fantasy with a love triangle is looked down on, never mind if the other themes within the book are hard-hitting. Non-YA fantasy readers may dismiss the inclusion of romance in these books, but they do serve a purpose. Young people need to have their voices heard. They need to experience and grow and discover their sexuality in different forms, and this includes in reading books. Not to mention the fact that YA fantasy tackles queer relationships like no other genre I know, YA does in general. Adult fantasy is severely lacking in this area. So while romance may be a little bit tropey and predictable in YA fantasy books, it exists for a reason and should not be shunned. And along those same lines, it's no secret that writers of colour, women, and queer people find it easier to be published in YA compared to adult fantasy. Because of this, many YA fantasy books share different perspectives and hard-hitting topics that allow readers to see themselves in these books. YA books are geared towards up-and-coming generations, so what we see change in the world we'll see reflected in these YA fantasy books. And while there's still a lot of work to be done, adult fantasy just doesn't have this kind of representation. Adult fantasy tends to be written by wealthy, well-educated white people who have enough time and money to write these books in their spare time. Honestly, this could be a video all on its own. There are a huge amount of YA fantasy books out there that rival their adult fantasy counterparts, and as I said, I'm an avid reader of both. There are also a lot of crappy YA fantasy books, and there are also a lot of crappy adult fantasy books. YA, like adult fantasy, is a vast world, and it's frustrating to see people put it down or see themselves as above it. Let's just say that no matter what you're reading, nobody should put you down for reading it. You should read what brings you joy. I work a job that requires a lot of my brain, as I'm sure you do too, in some shape or form. And all I want to do after a hard day's work is come home and read about a young person who saves the world. And there is absolutely nothing wrong with that.